Welcome. I'm Rab. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Naomi Kalish from the Center for Pastoral Education at JTS. I'm grateful for us coming together today during this difficult time as we work to care for so many people in our professional lives, and we work to take care of ourselves and the people close to us in our personal lives. I'll have more to say, but in a moment we'll turn it over to Rabbi Ilanit Goldberg-Gradess, who will begin our program. We will also be joined by Cantor Raphael Frieden towards the end of the program today. I do want to note that our program is being recorded. We will have opportunities for questions, and you can submit those in the comments, and we'll come to them towards the end of the program as the time permits. For the most part, we will play it by ear in terms of how much of a conversation to have, but do want to let people know that we are recording this session as the topic has been requested for people that we share the recording. Rabbi Goldberg-Gradess.
I want to start us with a song, and it's a song from my childhood, based on the words of Ecclesiastes. Lakol zman va'et, tachat shamayim, to everything there is a season under the heavens. Et le'ehov ve'et lisno, a time to love and a time to hate. Et milchama ve'et shalom, time for war and a time for peace. Lakol zman va'et tachat hashamayim, 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 lehom lisno et milchama oy milchama ve'et shalom et lehom lisno et milchama oy milchama ve'et shalom. So I'm beginning us here on the topic of caring for self and others, because for me, music and song and connection to Jewish text and Jewish tradition is part of how I do both of those things. It's part of how I care for myself and for others. I work at JTS and direct the hospice and end-of-life clinical pastoral education program, where I do a lot of caring for others, and as a chaplain, do a lot of caring for others. And this is a time where I'm living through, and we are all living through, very much a crisis that demands that we care for others, but also requires that we care for ourselves. So the text that keeps pulling at me and running through my head is this text from Ecclesiastes, from Kohelet. And the song that I sang is a song from my youth that I've been singing to my children. I have a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old. I've been singing it to them as part of their bedtime. And the caring that I'm doing and that many of us are doing intersects all parts of our lives. It's caring for congregants or students, community members, caring for family members, both here and in Israel, caring for friends, both here and in Israel. For some of us, caring for large groups of people, organizations, and then also the people that are closest to us and who we're most intimate with. And I want to share more of this text and a little bit more of how I've been thinking about this. So I'm going to share my screen and turn to Kohelet. A season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time for being born and a time for dying, a time for planting and a time for uprooting planted, a time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing, a time for wailing and a time for dancing, a time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones, a time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripping and a time for sewing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace. There's so much in this text, in the universalizing of the experience of all of this as part of life, not just for us today, but for most people at most times. And in turning to an ancient Jewish text, there's something comforting for me about that our experience today is rooted in an understanding that comes from the Torah, comes from the book of Kohelet, that war is a part of the human experience. It's not a human experience that I want for any of us, but that it is part of the human experience, and that weeping is part of the human experience, and that tearing down is part of the human experience, and all of this, and that the inverse is also true. And there's part of me that cries out at this text, that rails against it because I don't want it to be so. And that railing against and crying out against is also part of what I think our Jewish tradition invites us to do. And so I'm going to share another text that I think of as part of our Jewish tradition by Yehuda Amichai, and holds both of these voices together at the same time. Yehuda Amichai, an Israeli poet who is beloved by many, including me. A man doesn't have time in his life to have time for everything. He doesn't have seasons enough to have a season for every purpose. Ecclesiastes was wrong about that. A man needs to love and to hate at the same moment, to laugh and cry with the same eyes, with the same hands to throw stones and to gather them, to make love in war and war in love, and to hate and forgive and remember and forget, to arrange and confuse, to eat and to digest what history takes years and years to do. Man doesn't have time. When he loses, he seeks. When he finds, he forgets. When he forgets, he loves. When he loves, he begins to forget. And his soul is seasoned. His soul is very professional. Only his body remains forever an amateur. It tries and it misses, gets muddled, doesn't learn a thing, drunk and blind in its pleasures and its pains. He will die as figs die in autumn, shriveled and full of himself and sweet. The leaves growing dry on the ground, the bare branches pointing to the place where there's time for everything. So I shared this poem to bring it into dialogue with the piece from Kohelet in a way that feels true to me spiritually for the moment that I'm finding myself in, and I think that many of us are, where it's all happening at the same time. There is war and loss and grief. And many of us in Jewish community leadership are faced with holding that for the members of our communities and for ourselves and for our close friends and loved ones, while also celebrating births, b'nai mitzvah, officiating at weddings. And while that has always been a part of the role of religious leaders, in our time, it feels more poignant than ever, as many of us are affected so directly by the grief and the loss and the war. I'm going to stop the share. And I want to talk a bit more about what it means to provide care while needing care ourselves. My assumption is that everyone in the Jewish community is in need of care right now, even those of us in positions of leadership. And for me, part of that is about remembering what gives me spiritual strength and sustenance. That's part of why I started us with song and with Jewish text and with poetry. And when I think about spirituality, I think about what gives us hope and meaning in times where it may be incredibly hard to experience hope and meaning. And at the core of that is connection. And that connection can look like so many different things for different people. It can be connection to people, to others, whether that's talking to loved ones or being in their presence when that's possible, being connected in whatever ways we can to people who are both far and near, connection to music, to nature, to poetry, to prayer, to God, and offering that to others. We, in our advertising for this program, mentioned a trauma-informed approach to care, which I think is particularly important now, both in our care for others and ourselves. Part of what that means is starting with the assumption that the people that we are caring for, that many of the people we're caring for have experienced trauma. And I don't mean just now, I mean earlier, and that grief and loss in this moment may be bringing up earlier traumas. And so in caring for others at this time, I think it's particularly important to offer support and care, but to not push people to share too much. To really recognize that boundaries can be very helpful. And so even in offering my support to others, some of that is not asking them to talk too much about what they're experiencing. Give people the space to share their feelings and to share their grief, but not pushing them when they don't want to talk, and finding other ways to connect, whether it's through sharing a text that may be helpful, or prayer or song. The other thing I've really been thinking about is the way that trauma takes a toll on our bodies. And for me as a caregiver, what that means is trying to incorporate movement into my day, even when I'm doing lots of sessions with people where I'm offering support and holding them in their grief, to make sure I'm getting up and moving my body, connecting with my breath, connecting with how I'm feeling in my body. So I offer that to you as kind of two short pieces of information about what might be helpful in terms of a trauma-informed approach to care. Lastly, I want to touch on resilience and what resilience means to me at this time. It can be so hard to access hope when we're in the midst of despair. Despair for the loss of loved ones, for the people who we may be connected to personally, or by 1 or 2 degrees of separation, who were killed in the Hamas attacks on Saturday. And afterwards, despair and fear for loved ones in Israel, for people we do and don't know on all sides of the border, for Palestinians who are affected by the war and experiencing loss, and the sense of what can help with the sense of despair is turning back to our religious resources that support hope and faith in our broader humanity. I want to turn back to Ecclesiastes, to the piece of text that I shared. So I'll share my screen one more time and go back up to the top, because in this last verse that I shared here, Kohelet writes, "A time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace." The story can't end with war. the story needs to end with peace. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks you for those words of Torah and insight about how we can care for ourselves as well as draw from the wisdom of our tradition during this most difficult time. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our partner institutions for co-sponsoring our event today, the Cantors Assembly, the Rabbinical Assembly, Neshama, the Association of Jewish Chaplains. It's so meaningful to and important to come together from the wide span of different professions and different approaches to leadership from which we come, as we are called on in so many different ways within our professions as cantors, rabbis, educators, chaplains, teachers, communal leaders, administrators, behind the scenes work that people do. We're called on in so many different ways to respond to this moment and to support people. And so it's incredibly meaningful to me that we come together also as our organizations to support our broader community and professional communities. I'd like to share my screen in a moment, and what I'll be presenting are some Torah as well as some insights from the different behavioral sciences or other areas of reflection and research and insight about human functioning and experience. And sometimes during crisis, it's just really helpful to have some theories to help hold us and guide us. And the same with Torah, that our tradition provides us with wisdom and insight as well. And so when we sometimes don't know what to say, to have some insight in either saying or maybe not speaking, when we're experiencing distress in our own experience, and when we're trying to be with other people experiencing distress, it's helpful to have some other perspectives. So from that spirit, I'll be sharing some insights. Just need to find my document, you'd think. At this point with Zoom, it would be easier. Here we go. Some of my comments will just reflect also what Rabbi Goldberg-Gradess has said. It's so easy to be physically alone or to feel existentially alone at this time. And it's so important and meaningful to come together and to experience connection and relationship and community and belonging. And all of these are greatly challenged and create a spiritual distress in the isolated feelings that we may have during this time. I was thinking about the theory developed by Robert Putnam in his book, Bowling Alone, in which he talks about different types of human connection. And he makes a distinction between bonding social capital, which is what he means for social connecting, and bridging. And bonding is basically when we look inward and to our home base community and we strengthen it. And bridging is when we reach across and connect with people from other communities. I've heard a lot of people, and I'll say more about this, talking about the changes and the feelings that are coming up in terms of both their experience within the Jewish community as well as with the broader community or with partners beyond the Jewish community. And what I like about about this theory that he puts forward is he doesn't judge where one puts one's energy. That there are times in which being inward looking is very important, and there are times in which bridging and community building is very important. Right now, it's very difficult, as the poetry and song and prayer that we just heard reinforces, which is there's just not a lot of time. We have multiple feelings, simultaneous feelings at the same time. But sometimes in our actions, we can only engage so much at one point. I was thinking about, in terms of the internal work that we do, it's tremendously important, and much of what we're called upon now is formally, like some of our meets vote, and some of it seems kind of more broadly values that we have at this current moment. There are dead to be buried. There are people who are ill to be cared for and treated and visited, either directly or through the ripple effects of supporting people who are connected directly. There are captives to be rescued. There is tremendous prayer within our communities that is needed, and pastoral care that's needed. There's also so much that's important externally at this time also, in terms of peace building between leaders and community members. And so I think it's up to each of us in our roles to figure out where to put our energy, and to also recognize that thankfully there's many of us, and no one of us needs to carry all of that at one time. We also have the challenge that each one of us is currently occupying many different roles and responsibilities. We have ourself to take care of and to tend to. We have our personal relationships and roles. We have our professional roles, and then we have responsibilities with those. So one of our questions in this session is to really focus on the pastoral components. And thankfully, there's other resources and sessions being offered in terms of offering prayer at this time, teaching at this time, preaching at this time, making public statements at this time. Like, each of these is really intensely called upon at this time, and they have some differences. So in our session, what does it mean to care for our spirits? What does it mean to care for our own neshamas and for the neshamas of the people in our care? Well, so I think it's very helpful to think about grief at this time. We have very complex grief, meaning that that there's many different aspects of loss, and it's hard when there's complex grief, and when there's multiple griefs and multiple losses. It's hard to grieve because it's hard to focus on them. It's, if you could even think in a less overwhelming situation, like let's say there's 2 deaths in a family at the same time. It's hard to grieve for 2 people at the same time. So right now we have multiple deaths, and we have all sorts of other areas in addition to death, of loss, loss of a sense of security, loss of some relationships. The list is really endless, and that's actually a really good pastoral question to ask people and to ask ourselves, like, what are we grieving at this time? There's also tremendous ambiguous loss, in the sense of, like, we just don't know. Like, there's a lot of fear and uncertainty, and that creates a real sense of anxiousness. And there's also disenfranchised loss, and that could be coming up, which is when an experience of loss is not recognized. And I think that can happen interpersonally. It can most definitely is happening with some of the relationships we have beyond the Jewish community, to not have the horror and trauma of this recognized in certain spaces and by certain people or institutions. And it also can be happening within the Jewish community too, in terms of, and that's part of the challenge of our leadership, is what we focus on and what we don't focus on. I may say a little bit more about that further on. It's also helpful to think about the experience of trauma. Trauma understood as a person's emotional response to a distressing experience that can have lasting adverse effects on their mental, physical, emotional, social, or spiritual well-being. And it's helpful to recognize that what we may be experiencing is trauma. I mean, it's an incredibly traumatizing experience. The different people have different responses, so we also don't want to assume everyone's having the same response. I have had my own experiences, as well as talking with many people this past week, of feeling ill, like physically ill, not sleeping, stress dreams. All of these are examples of the way this traumatic event has impact. And as Rabbi Goldberg-Gradess also said, a physical impact. And then there's also mental impacts, like cognitive impacts, not being able to think as straight as well, to organize things. So what I like to emphasize here also is that secondary or vicarious trauma is very important to recognize and to acknowledge that one doesn't have to be in the physical place of this horrific series of events to experience vicarious trauma. Research has been done that, like some of the current day neuroscience research in terms of the way the brain responds to traumatic events, and even listening to the details of a traumatic event can be traumatizing. I think probably, I would imagine we all recognize the dangers of social media and of kind of mainstream media also can be traumatizing. That's very difficult for us as leaders, because we have some responsibility to know what's taking place, but we also need to have some boundaries and some protections so that we're not over traumatized by all of the, and often it's sensory inputs, it's visual images, it's sometimes sounds, it could be other aspects of the senses. So to just recognize, as leaders and as caregivers, we're exposed, and it's very important to put boundaries up. Some of the spiritual distress that takes place is the sense, our own sense of loss of voice, loss of meaning, purpose, narrative. And so all of this is some of what we need to do ourselves as well. We don't have the luxury of, just fully separating and working out our perspectives on everything. We need to do some of this simultaneously, or weaving back and forth between care of self and care of others, but to give ourselves spaces for not having words or seeking words, telling our own stories, shedding our own tears. From a spiritual care perspective, there's different paradigms for what is spirituality, and that sometimes that can be helpful as we listen to others and as we also think about ourselves. And so some of the areas that spiritual care focuses on are hope, meaning, connection, sense of purpose, belonging, behaving, and believing. And during this time, we have a tremendous challenge to our spirituality, to all of these, to our sense of belonging and some of the relationships. Sometimes our spirituality is strengthened. Like some people may be feeling more connected with the Jewish community in a way that's positive. Many people are feeling really disrupted relationships at this time also. And And so I think that's really important as we're talking to people to recognize that they're experiencing a sense of brokenness in how they made sense of the world, and for many people, how they made sense of being Jewish. I've been thinking about the Psalm for Shmini Atzeret. When when the news came on Yom Tov and Shabbat a week and a half ago, a comment in the margins of the Siddur stood out to me, that in this opening line of the psalm, Lecha Dumya Tehila Elohim B'Tzion, that this word Dumya can be translated in almost like with seemingly opposite ways. So it's often translated as hope, or praise. So hope befits you in Zion, or praise befits you in Zion. But the other one, which is like Vayidom Aharon, and Aaron was silent after his personal tragedy, that silence befits you. And so I find this to be helpful as we think about being caregivers and also people in need of care, and hopefully the recipients of care, that we can be silent and without words, bereft of words, or we can be finding hope or expressing praise. Whatever is the emotional or spiritual response, to just that does not need any kind of critique from us or from others. I want to just review quickly, but we will send out the slides. And just that I encourage you, depending on which kind of locations you work in, to be thinking about the unique situations that come up in different types of work that we do. And so at this time, the experience of children is very important to give some attention to, in our schools, in our families, in our home communities, in our extended families, our friends, that the experience of children, they will be picking up on the emotion of what's taking place. But there are some good questions about how we engage, or maybe don't engage. When we were preparing for this session, we were talking about, actually, sometimes it's perfectly good to not address this situation unless it's raised by a young person. Now, if they're exposed to hearing the news or adult conversations, or they're feeling the tension, then it's helpful to, in a brief way, let them know that there's a conflict, but to not go into more details than you think are helpful. So this organization, which is the National Association of School Psychologists, has some excellent resources that are considered best practices in terms of how to engage with children. And of course, it would depend on their age, but to reassure them that they're safe. Now, we as adults may think like, well, are we ever fully safe? And of course, we couldn't have this taking place. All of that is true. However, especially for us, not in Israel at this point, to reassure them that they are safe and that we take safety precautions. And to even let them know, like, we have security, and to make space for their feelings and for them to talk. And if there's something that needs correcting, to correct it, if there's a factual correction, but also to remember that children are doing their own meaning making. And then to try to help them with routines, just normal routines. Sometimes what we find is when we talk about children, sometimes the advice is also good for adults as well, and for ourselves as well. And we're wrestling, I think, with all of those as well. I've been thinking a lot about the experience of college students, and I would also add young graduate students. There's some distinguishing features about what they're going through as well, because so many of the deaths, obviously not all, but many of the kidnappings and the concert that took place are peers of this age group. There could be a very strong identification of, like it could have been me. I mean, it could have been me is probably true for, all of us in some ways, but the age identification is very real. Also, many people in our communities and these young people have relationships with people who have been killed or are in captivity now. And so that also creates a direct relationship. The rhetoric on college campuses, as we know, has gotten a lot of attention over many years and has obviously escalated. I have two screenshots of what took place in the neighborhood of the Jewish Theological Seminary at Columbia University last week, with major protests for both a kind of pro-Palestine, though really a kind of pro-Hamas in spirit event, and then also a pro-Israel event. And this is very difficult. Students are expressing around the country that they're not sure about their safety, but also students are expressing some difficulty with this binary that has been created in the larger society. And I think many people experience this also, but the conflict has, in some spheres, really reduced to kind of like two perspectives. And this is creating some spiritual distress among people who are looking for a more nuanced approach, an ability to, like, for example, this isn't for everyone, obviously, but to, let's say, be critical of certain policies of the state of Israel and support the humanitarian needs of Palestinians, and not in any way condone or support the atrocities committed by Hamas. So it's very confusing because it's shattered some paradigms for people. And this is when it's helpful for us to think about, when are we in a teaching mode and when are we in a pastoral care mode, or when are we in a policy making mode? So if a student's coming to us because their identity or their meaning making is shattered at this point, we need to just give them some space to talk about that. I've included a website for an organization that specializes in grief for the college student age. We could call this moral distress also, and I think this is true beyond the college years, of when a person finds a sense of meaning or purpose, or work that they do that they believe is the work of justice, and they're not able to engage in that. They experience a moral distress. And I think this is also perhaps true for many of us. I wanted to just conclude, and then I'm going to turn it over to Cantor Frieder, that there is a question among many of us, though again, like I said, it does not need to be the focus at this point, but for some people, some leaders, one of the areas of loss is the loss of that middle ground, the loss of the community partners, the peace building work that many of us have done or do. And so I think, like I said at the beginning, we need to decide where to put our energy. Community relations is hard work. There's always going to be something that's said not the way one would say it themselves. So there's a kind of ability to be, like, almost, you could think, but to be offended, like, or to be just rubbed the wrong way. But that's part of the work of meeting people who see the world differently. But for people who are interested, I encourage us, like, I have received several messages from Muslims, Palestinians, Christians, and other faith traditions, inquiring about how I'm doing. And when we have energy, it's wonderful to be able to be that person to others going through this conflict. And so we do have Torah, which supports the coming together across difference. And so here I have the quotation from Genesis of Isaac and Ishmael coming together to bury Abraham. We have other traditions. And the last I'd like to point out is one of my interfaith partners who I know through the organization, the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, who works in diversity, DEI work in the corporate setting. Herself has been posting a humanitarian message as well as drawing from Islam about peaceful coexistence between Jews and Muslims. And I'm grateful for that. So I'm going to conclude my session at this point and turn it over to our last speaker.
Hello, everybody. Just want to find myself. I'm here, yes. I wasn't sure. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how to use music and singing tefillot or singing songs that have some meaning and could possibly make people connect a little better and a little more emotionally to the situation. And so my thought is that what would be always good is to find a couple of tunes, couple of songs that the people, the congregation, or the group of people that you're with, or even if it's trying to comfort a few people or a family, to find a song or a couple of songs that they are familiar with. And there's also, you can also look for something that seem to be very clearly moving people. And I would say that maybe, I mean, my practice has been that I start with something that is more kind of slow and somber, and then I finished with something that is a little more upbeat and hopeful. So these are the directions that I usually like to go. And I'd like to demonstrate to you a couple of songs that I was thinking about regarding this situation. So I think that, again, people know very well Kol Haolam Kulo. Kol Haolam Kulo Gesher Tzar Meod, very narrow bridge, and sometimes it becomes much narrower, and to the point that we don't know if we can go on and cross and go and move on. And then V'haikar lo lefachet klal, and let's try not to be scared. That's my translation. Because the real literal translation, the main thing is to not to be scared. Well, let's try to not to be scared, because we're not always, we can't be in control of that. But there is some, statement of the challenge, and statement of how to deal with it, how to go. And I think it's a songs that I haven't seen anybody who doesn't like this song or is not connected to one degree or other to this song. So I would always start with that song, and then there is a possibility to do something that people don't necessarily know, but you think that it might be again connecting and moving. And I would like to present to you a song like that, which the text is taken from the Shema Kolenu Tefillah. Well, the first sentence is like exactly like the holidays, but then there is the weekly Amidah, the daily Amidah that we say, חוס ורחם עלינו, וקבל ברחמים וברצון את תפילתנו, כי אל שומע תפילות ותחנונים אתה, because you're listening to our prayers. So this is a setting that I actually wrote in response of COVID, when COVID started and was really bad. And I thought, Shema Kolenu, please hear our prayer. And I'd like to present it to you. Shema Kolenu, Hashem Eloheinu, Chus v'rachem aleinu, v'kabel berachamim u'v'ratzon et tefilatenu. Shema Kolenu, Hashem Elokeinu, Chus v'rachem aleinu, v'kabel berachamim u'v'ratzon et tefilatenu. Ki el shomea tefilot, v'tachanunim ata. Ki el shomea tefilot, v'tachanunim ata. Shema Kolenu, Hashem Eloheinu, Chus v'rachem aleinu, v'kabel berachamim u'v'ratzon et tefilatenu. So that's that. And from here, the process is to try to find something that is a little more optimistic and basically hopeful. And I think that, again, in this situation, what I would choose is Am Yisrael Chai. Again, that's one of the songs that a lot of people are familiar with, and in a way, it's a reminder. Okay, we're going through a tough time, but Am Yisrael Chai, we are alive, and we'll continue to go on and handle the situation, and please God, it's going to get better. So each of you in your muted place, you're welcome to join me, but with that we'll conclude, I think, our session. Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael Chai. Or Rabbeinu, or Rabbeinu, or Rabbeinu Chai. Or Rabbeinu, or Rabbeinu, or Rabbeinu Chai. Or Rabbeinu, or Rabbeinu, or Rabbeinu Chai. Or Rabbeinu Chai. Or Rabbeinu, or Rabbeinu, or Rabbeinu Chai. Or Rabbeinu, or Rabbeinu, or Rabbeinu Chai. Or Rabbeinu, or Rabbeinu, or Rabbeinu Chai. Or Rabbeinu Chai. So I wish us all shenishma besorot tovot. May we hear good news sometime very, very soon. Thank you.
Amen. And thank you. That was really so meaningful to both hear from you as well as and learn from you and sing with you.